In the pantheon of American comedy, few names resonate as deeply as George Carlin. A pioneer, a provocateur, and a prophet of the absurd, Carlin was more than just a comedian. He was a cultural icon who used humor as a weapon to challenge the status quo. His sharp wit and unflinching honesty tore through the fabric of societal norms, exposing the hypocrisies and contradictions that others preferred to ignore. Carlin's career spanned 5 decades, during which he evolved from a clean-cut performer on mainstream television to a countercultural hero, unafraid to tackle taboo subjects with biting satire. Yet, behind the laughs and the bravado was a man whose life was marked by deep personal struggles, a relentless pursuit of truth, and an ending as poignant as his most memorable routines. Born on May 12, 1937, in Manhattan, New York City, George Dennis Patrick Carlin came into the world at a time when America was on the cusp of change. The son of an Irish-American working-class family, Carlin's early life was far from the glamorous world of show business. His father, Patrick Carlin, worked in advertising but struggled with alcoholism, a disease that would eventually tear the family apart. When George was just 2 months old, his father left the family, leaving George and his older brother, Patrick Jr., to be raised by their mother, Mary Berry. Mary Berry was a devout Roman Catholic, and she imposed her strict religious beliefs on her children. But young George was never one to conform. Even as a child, he exhibited a rebellious streak, questioning authority and challenging the dogmas of the church. This defiant spirit would become a hallmark of his later work, as he used his platform to critique the very institutions he was raised to revere. Carlin's education was as turbulent as his home life. He attended a series of Catholic schools, where his behavior often landed him in trouble. Carlin later described his time in Catholic school as one of the formative experiences of his life, where he first developed his distrust of authority figures and his skepticism of religious teachings. At 15, he dropped out of high school, choosing instead to pursue a life that was anything but ordinary. Despite his lack of formal education, Carlin was a voracious reader and a lover of language. He had a particular affinity for the works of Mark Twain and Jonathan Swift, authors known for their wit and social criticism. This love of language and satire would become a central theme in Carlin's comedy, as he used words not just to entertain, but to provoke thought and challenge societal norms. In 1954, at the age of 17, Carlin enlisted in the United States Air Force, training as a radar technician. However, his rebellious nature persisted, and he frequently clashed with authority. His time in the military was marked by a series of disciplinary actions, including court-martial for his refusal to obey orders. Despite these setbacks, Carlin used his time in the Air Force to hone his comedic skills, entertaining his fellow servicemen with his sharp wit and irreverent humor. After leaving the Air Force, Carlin teamed up with Jack Burns, a fellow serviceman and aspiring comedian. Together, they formed the comedy duo Burns and Carlin, performing in nightclubs and on radio stations across the country. Their partnership was a modest success, and they even secured a regular gig at a radio station in Fort Worth, Texas. But it was clear that Carlin had ambitions beyond the small-time circuit. In 1960, he moved to Los Angeles, where he began performing solo. It was here that Carlin's career began to take off. His early material was relatively conventional, focusing on observational humor and clever wordplay. He quickly gained a reputation for his quick wit and sharp delivery, earning him spots on popular television shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. During this period, Carlin cultivated a clean-cut image that appealed to mainstream audiences. He was the quintessential young comedian of the early 1960s, well-dressed, polite, and always ready with a punchline that was clever without being controversial. But beneath the surface, Carlin was growing increasingly dissatisfied with the constraints of his image and the limitations of mainstream comedy. As the 1960s progressed, so did Carlin's disillusionment with the status quo. The decade was a time of social upheaval in America, with the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the rise of the counterculture challenging the established order. Carlin found himself increasingly at odds with the expectations placed on him as a performer. He began to experiment with edgier material, influenced by the countercultural movement and the groundbreaking work of comedians like Lenny Bruce. Carlin's transformation was both personal and professional. He grew out his hair, adopted a more casual style of dress, and began to focus on themes that were far removed from the light-hearted observational humor of his early career. He started to tackle issues like censorship, religion, politics, and the absurdities of modern life. This shift alienated some of his earlier fans but earned him a new, younger audience who resonated with his anti-establishment views. One of the most significant moments in Carlin's career came in 1972 with the release of his album Class Clown. The album featured a routine titled 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television, a bit that would become one of the most famous, and infamous, in the history of comedy. In this routine, Carlin dissected the arbitrary nature of censorship, questioning why certain words were deemed unacceptable for broadcast while others were not. The routine was both hilarious and thought-provoking, showcasing Carlin's ability to blend humor with social commentary. The 7 Words routine became a cultural flashpoint, sparking debates about free speech and censorship that would continue for years. In 1973, a father in New York heard the routine on the radio and filed a complaint with the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. The case, FCC v. Pacifica Foundation, eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, where in 1978, the court ruled in favor of the FCC, allowing the government to regulate indecent material on public airwaves. The ruling was a setback for free speech advocates, but it only solidified Carlin's reputation as a fearless comedian who was unafraid to push boundaries. The case also highlighted the ongoing tension between the right to free expression and the government's role in regulating public morality, a theme that would recur throughout Carlin's work. While Carlin's professional life was soaring, his personal life was plagued by challenges. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Carlin struggled with drug addiction, particularly to cocaine. His substance abuse was both a symptom of his inner turmoil and a coping mechanism for the pressures of his career. Carlin later admitted that his drug use was fueled by a need to escape from the demands of fame and the expectations placed on him as a public figure. Carlin's addiction took a heavy toll on his health, leading to multiple heart attacks and hospitalizations. Despite these setbacks, he continued to perform, often using his struggles as material for his comedy. His routines during this period reflected a darker, more cynical outlook on life, as he grappled with his own mortality and the absurdities of the world around him. In the 1990s, Carlin underwent another transformation, both in his personal life and his comedy. He eventually overcame his addiction and began to focus on his health, but his outlook on life remained as sharp and critical as ever. His comedy became more philosophical, reflecting his deepening sense of disillusionment with society. Carlin's routines during this period, such as those featured in his HBO specials Jammin' in New York, 1992, Back in Town, 1996, and You Are All Diseased, 1999, were marked by a sense of anger and despair as he railed against what he saw as the decline of American society. Carlin's material during this period often dealt with themes of death, war, environmental destruction, and the erosion of civil liberties. He viewed the world through a lens of cynicism, seeing humanity as a species doomed by its own greed and stupidity. Despite, or perhaps because of, his increasingly bleak worldview, Carlin remained a beloved figure in comedy, admired for his intellectual rigor and unwavering commitment to speaking truth to power. As Carlin entered the 2000s, his health continued to deteriorate. Years of drug abuse, combined with a family history of heart disease, had taken a severe toll on his body. He suffered from multiple heart attacks, underwent surgery for blocked arteries, and struggled with heart failure. Despite these health issues, Carlin remained dedicated to his craft, continuing to perform and release new material. In 2004, Carlin released his final HBO special, It's Bad For Ya, which was filmed just months before his death. The special was a fitting conclusion to his career, showcasing a comedian who, even in his final days, remained as sharp, provocative, and uncompromising as ever. The routine included reflections on aging, death, and the absurdity of societal norms, themes that had defined much of his later work. Carlin's comedy in It's Bad For Ya was a distillation of everything he had come to represent: irreverent, unapologetic, and deeply insightful. He reflected on his own mortality with the same unflinching honesty that had characterized his career, delivering a performance that was both hilarious and profoundly moving. It was clear that Carlin was aware of his own impending death, but rather than shy away from it, he embraced it as yet another absurdity to be mocked. On June 22, 2008, George Carlin passed away from heart failure at the age of 71. His death marked the end of an era in comedy, but his legacy endures. Carlin's influence can be seen in the work of countless comedians who followed in his footsteps, pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo. His routines remain as relevant today as they were when they were first performed, serving as a reminder of the power of comedy to challenge, provoke, and inspire.